What's up guys, it's CZ here, welcome back to Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck of the Day. Today we're taking a look at a Pendulum Magician deck, a deck that we haven't tackled in quite some time, and finally Konami has shown Pendulum players some love from the ban list. Although we did not get back Electromite, which is what people were expecting and are still expecting, and will always keep thinking that this card is always going to come back, but it still wasn't that time it seems. But still we got some good cards, and I think that Pendulum Magician is probably the most adored Pendulum deck of all time, so I'm really happy that we're finally able to play this deck in a much more competitive way, because unfortunately the only Pendulum deck that you could potentially play in a competitive level was Endymion, and now we finally have some other stuff, and this is probably the most different deck out of any Pendulum deck. It is not a deck that brings out 1,000 negates and tries to end the game in one turn. It's kind of a grind deck, and which is why I think it's very interesting, because Pendulums don't really do that, especially nowadays, because you need to make an unbreakable board to win, but this deck can grind really well, so I'm going to show you the deck that I've come up with. And there are so many different ways to play Pendulums, so it's not like this set in stone that this is the only potential build for a deck like this, but I think this is what has been working the most consistent for me, so here it is. But before we begin, if you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming content, and now let's get to the deck profile. So starting off with the Magicians, we have 2 copies of Double Iris. You can expect this card 100% to be at 3 in the next ban list. That's going to make a huge difference, because this card searches you the grind deck and the potential to be able to go disrupt your opponent, because this deck's grind all comes from this card. The one of the 2 cards that this card searches gives you the infinite grind game. One of the big problems that Pendulums have is that these decks cannot grind. They usually use their entire hand to make as big a board as possible, and then if that board gets broken, then it's pretty much over, because you can only Pendulum summon 1 monster from the extra deck and you don't have a lot of stuff in your hand. But this deck doesn't really do that. This deck tries to make a minimal board that can still prevent your opponent from playing, which is very easy because you can do this one single card I'm going to show you that this deck can utilize very easily, and then it can have so many resources because so many cards net you more cards into your hand, which we're going to get a little bit later, and Double Iris is one of them, and there are so many different ways to pop this card so you can get the searches. So this card is really good, and it'll definitely be a 3-off once it comes back to 3. 2 Purple Poison. You don't really need 3 copies of any of the Magicians that I'm going to show you the next 3 cards. These cards are decent scales that you usually search. Their effects are good, but they're not as relevant as they used to be. Purple Poison is still a really good card because it gives you double pop with Pendulum Graph, especially if you can protect it, that you can use during the next turn as well to get 4 pops, which is why this card is really good. And the effect that it pops itself can catch a lot of people by surprise. When a Dark Spellcaster battles, you destroy this on your own, it gains 1200 attack, and then you can also destroy a card, which is why this card is really good. And this is how you deal with Floodgates, because there are some Floodgates that this deck cannot deal with, but this card is how you deal with them, because even if you just set it as a monster and it gets popped, then you can maybe pop an anti-spell so you can destroy that as well. So this card has a lot of utility in the deck. 2 copies of Black Fang. I really like Black Fang. I think this card gives you so much more, because you can just bring back so many monsters from the grave, and this deck is mostly a rank 4 toolbox, so you do get a lot of monsters in the graveyard. It's not like other Pendulum decks when you only link and synchro summon, so everything goes back into the extra deck. You XC summon a lot in this deck, so there will be monsters in your graveyard so you can bring back with this card, and being able to use this to get to half your opponent's monster attack points, you can really go for big damage, because of Double Iris' double damage, so you can surprise your opponent, and especially with a card like the Servant Dark Rebellion, then you can just pretty much one-shot your opponent very, very easily, so this is why this card is really, really good. 2 copies of Oath Dragon. This is one of the cards that net you more cards back into your hand. Each turn you are going to get back a Magician from your extra deck to your hand. It's really important because Harmonizing can only be special summoned from the hand, so you need to get her back every single time so you can get her to the field, and this card is a really good low scale. Usually the scales you want to get to is a Black Fang and an Oath Dragon. Purple Poison is something that you want to either have on the field or you want to keep in your hand for when you need it, because when you're using your time start, you don't really need your Purple Poison in order to pop 2 cards. You can do that by just protecting the scale you're trying to break with your Pendulum Graph, so this is why you don't really need it, especially early game. You need to keep it for when your opponent is trying to push so you can break their board, and this is why Oath Dragon is a much better card, because it gives you more cards every single turn. 3 copies of Wisdom Eye. It feels so good being able to play this card again. It's been such a nostalgic road trip with this card, because we've used it ever since the structure deck came out, and the deck was super different back then. It didn't have the cards from Pendulum Evolution, so this is why a card like this is so nostalgic, and it's a good card. And because you can keep bringing all these cards on the field and using double Wisdom Eye, getting back from the extra deck with your Oath Dragon, just opening double Wisdom Eye is an insta rank 4 on the field without having anything else, and this card gets you to anything. It gets you to a high scale, it gets you to a low scale, it gets you everything you need. Such a great card. 3 copies of Harmonizing. This card is arguably the best card in the deck, because you can get either Synchro plays, Xyz plays, so many good stuff. Being able to special summon a Magician from the deck means that you can get to pretty much anything you want, and you need to be able to get this card with Oath Dragon every single turn back to your hand so you can keep spamming it, because unfortunately it cannot be summoned from the extra deck. And the scaling effect actually comes up a couple times by boosting your Magicians by 100 attack for each different Magician in your extra deck. this comes up sometimes and you can beat over certain monsters with this, because there will be scenarios where you can just Pendulum summon an Oath Dragon, use its monster effect to get back a Magician from the graveyard, and then have a monster with potentially more than 2500 attack points because of this card's scale effect, so you can beat over some stuff. 3 copies of Tuning Magician. This is a card a lot of people didn't really play back in the day, and I think that now this card is super important for the deck, just because it's a free discard that is arguably better than Darkworm, because Darkworm was a go-to play when you were using stuff like Pendulum Call, but this card being a tuner now with Needle Fiber just gets you to so much more plays, because just being able to use this from the graveyard after you've discarded it, when you have 2 Magicians the scales, you can special summon from the hand or grave. It gives your opponent 400 life and you lose 400 life, so you have to be a little bit careful in time with this card. If you ever get into a grind game and you're going to a game 3, you should probably side this card out, but still this card gives you so much advantage, because just this and a monster can get you to an access code because of the Needle Fiber Selene play. So I think being able to go into something like that before you Pendulum summon, because every Pendulum deck's biggest choke point is when they Pendulum summon. If they haven't dealt with cards before they do that, if your opponent stops everything you're trying to do after you Pendulum summon, then that's pretty much the end of your turn, because the Pendulum summoning is the extension of the deck. So this is why you need to be able to go into something like an access code beforehand to maybe bait or pop any cards your opponent has, and then you can go for Pendulum summoning. So this is why I think Tuning Magician is a really good card. 1 Dragon Pit Magician. I'm still rocking the 1 Dragon Pit just because I want some backer removal in the main deck, because you're trying to rely on Time Pendulum Graph to go for backer removal is not really the most optimal thing, especially going second, because it's a trap card, so you're not going to resolve it early. So this is why 1 Dragon Pit is really good, and the deck has so many ways to recruit cards from the grave and from the extra deck, so it's very easy to have a spare one to discard with Dragon Pit, so I think this card is a really good one-off in the deck. We play 3 copies of Chronograph Sorcerer. Chronograph still, of course, a really good card, because it can get you to the 1 copy of your Time Gazer Magician. There will be a lot of times where you're going to put this in the scale, to be honest, because without Electromite, it's not super important to get a monster from the Link monster on the field before you Pendulum summon, because this deck doesn't really care about getting too many monsters from the extra deck, because you try to keep as many advantages in your hand as possible. You're never going to Pendulum summon 5 monsters without even thinking about it, because you need to be able to keep resources, so this is why putting this in the scale and then summoning your Chronograph from the extra deck might be more important, because you can summon a Link monster after you Pendulum summon, which is what the strategy of the deck is, because you have a certain play that you can do to stop your opponent's turn. So this is why you can keep in mind that this card you can be put in scale very, very well as well. Now for the Perform Pulse, we have 1 copy of Perform Pulse Calcrobat Joker. It's been such a long time since we were able to play this card, and I think that this card can safely come back to 2 and even 3 in the following formats. I think Monkey Board, as long as it's banned, this card is going to be fine, because it can be played in so many different decks. You can play it in Perform Pulse, you can play it in Magicians, you can play it in Odd Eyes. It's such a good starter and a really good normal summon, and a good normal summon is what Pendulum decks really, really need, and this is why I think this card is really good. And being at 1 doesn't really matter, because you have the 2 copies of your Performable Pendulum Sorcerer, so you can search it whenever you want, on top of popping your Pendulum Magicians, especially your Double Iris, so you can get the effects of you to get search Pendulum Graphs. And I do play 1 more target. I play 1 Performable Celestial Magician. This is another card that gives you access to a follow-up, because during the end phase of the turn you summon this, you're going to search a Pendulum, so being able to search 2 monsters with your Performable Pendulum Sorcerer is really good. And I don't like playing Giturtle, Laser Draw, stuff like that, at least not in a Magician deck. I think they're really bricky, because you cannot summon stuff like maybe your Dragon Pit from the extra deck, your Chronographs. Their scales are really weird, so I think being able to just get access to this card is really good. All of the Pendulum support that we have amassed throughout the years, which is, for example, this card right here, can give you a better understanding of what you can do with the deck, because stuff that the deck can do now was not able to do before, because cards like this did not exist, but now we have even more support. So the more cards we keep getting back from the ban list, the deck is going to actually become much more powerful than it ever used to be. I mean, of course, it's not going to be as powerful because Astrograph Sorcerer might never come back, but still, if we ever get back Electromite, cards like this is going to make so big of a difference, so big prepared for when that happens, because Pendulum players will be ready and waiting to prove that this deck is really, really good. 2 copies of Darkworm. Darkworm, I still believe it's a great card, even though I said Tuning Magician is a better card to summon because it's a tuner, but still this card, well, if you combine this with Pendulum Call, it feels like the most plus play in the history of, it's like resolving double engage, because this card gives you to your gate 0, you get to your scales, you get a free level 4 on the field, you can either go for an Xyz or you can go for a Link before you Pendulum summon. You can do so much, so this is why this card is really, really good. You don't really need to max it out, especially now, because sometimes you're going to Pendulum summon everything, and then you're going to search the Joker to normal summon afterwards, so you don't want to normal summon a Darkworm and then Pendulum summon, because when you have your Pendulum Sorcerer, you can get a much better normal summon. So this is why I think playing 2 is perfectly fine, because you'd rather discard it with your Pendulum Call or send to the grave with a Dragon Shrine or a Fool's Burial and then get access to it. 1 copy of Supreme Gain Gate 0, of course, starts with your Darkworm. And the last monster is 1 copy of Artifact Scythe. You can pretty much guess where this is going. This card, being able to get to it with Dagdan, you have so many ways to pop it. Being a rank 4 toolbox, the easiest way, you can just summon a Tornado Dragon. You can do so many things with this card, and being able to stop your opponent's turn without even having to go into the extra steps, you get like 6-7 negates on the field like usual Pendulum decks do, is so important, because if you try try to do that, you do not have a follow-up, and if your opponent like droplets or dark rulers your field, then you're going to lose. But this deck doesn't lose to stuff like that because it also has a trap that can protect your plays, and also being able to go into Scythe means that it does not lose to dark ruler because you do this in the standby phase. You do lose to droplet, yes, but then you have your Time Pendulum Graph as backup, and this is why being able to go into a grind deck instead of a combo deck, I feel is a much more beneficial for this type of deck, just because you can do so much more during the follow-up. For the spells, we have 3 copies of Duelist Alliance, of course, searching your Double Iris, searching your Performable Pendulum Sorcerer, searching the 1 copy of your Pendulum Goal, which might seem a little bit weird, but to be honest, this card is not that great. The only reason you play this 1 copy is because you can search with your Duelist Alliance in the hands that you don't really have anything and you desperately need to search 2 correct scales. Now, there are certain reasons why this card is not that great. The first reason is because it completely locks you out of Wisdom Eye, because you cannot activate Magician of Pendulum effects the turn you activate this, and also it prevents you from popping your Double Iris, so you cannot search your Time Pendulum Graph. So this card is a little bit restrictive. It used to be an insane card, but right now I don't think it's that great. You still need to play 1 because of the scenario I mentioned in case your hand is completely dead, so you can search with your Duelist Alliance, get the scales you need, but still I don't think you need to play more. It's going to be a little bricky when you start seeing it, and if you try to test it in more than 1 copy, you're going to realize really soon that it contradicts with a lot of stuff the deck tries to do, so this is why I think just 1 is perfectly fine. Now, a card I am playing in more than 1 that a lot of people are playing at 1 is 2 copies of Star Pendulum Graph. Every time I test this deck and I use this card always overperforms. This card is so great, being able to completely get more advantage during your own turn, during your opponent's turn is so important. This card is so good because you use your Magicians during both turns, you pop your Magicians during both turns, so you get basically 2 searches every single turn with Time Pendulum Graph, and you have so much advantage. So even if your opponent destroys your entire board, you can still have a set of scales in your hand to go into your plays next turn, which is what Pendulum decks really lack, and this is why this deck I think is really good, and this is why Star Pendulum Graph is an important card. And when you have your Time Pendulum Graph, you want to be able to search something else, so during the late game when you search this card as well is really good. So I think 2 copies are really good because you're going to get all the advantage, so I highly recommend trying this out in more than 1 copy. You're going to really like it. And the last spell is of course 1 copy of Foolish Burial, 1 copy of Dragon Shrine to get into your Dark Worm. Foolish Burial can also send the Tuning Magician in the grave to go into your Needle Fiber play, so it's not only restricted to sending Dark Worm, which is why you play 1 and 1. And the last card is 2 copies of Time Pendulum Graph. This is the biggest blowout in the deck, being able to pop 2 cards and being able to send one of the 2, not even pop 2 cards, you pop 1 and you send 1, means that you can destroy pretty much anything with this card, as long as you have either resolve the Pendulum Call or you have your Time Store on the field to protect the scale you're trying to pop. This card is so great. It's the only reason this deck is good, because if you didn't have this card, you would rely on something like a Baguska or maybe the Scythe play, and you would be so reliant on cards like that, and you would lose to stuff like Droplet. But because of this card, you're going to grind all the games, and while you're destroying your opponent's field, you are amassing more advantage, so you can kill them next turn. For the extra deck, for the Synchro Monsters, we have 1 copy of Ignister. Yes, this card is a 3, but you don't really need to play more than 1. You will never summon more than 1. This card is like the play you do when you're trying to kill your opponent, and with Harmonizing it's very easy to summon. 1 copy of Savage. You're hardly ever summoning this turn 1 because it's very difficult to get a Link Monster in the grave unless you go for the access code play early. If you do that with your Tuning Magician, then yes, you can have a Link 3 in the grave because Selene will be in the graveyard, and this is the only time where you're going to be able to do that. And sometimes even going into Selene is not that bad because you can just get into an Appaloosa before you even Pendulum summon, because Nibiru does kill this deck if you don't do that play. So this is another reason why Tuning Magician is so good, because instead of going to access code, turn 1 you're going into Appaloosa. Yes, with only 1600 attack points, but that's not the point. The point is that you can play around Nibiru, and also it doesn't matter that she has low attack points, because if your opponent tries to run her over, Time Pendulum Graph will just destroy the attacking monster, and that will be it. And 1 copy of Supreme King Dragon Clearwing. This card is really good. Being able to Raigeki your opponent's field is important, because sometimes you can just need to break a lot of cards, and Ignister is a good card, but being able to play around multiple monsters I think is something that you need to play in this deck, at least just to have the option. The deck is not really that tight, to be honest, so you can play a lot of different cards. You can play Omega if you want, and rather level 8 Synchro. There are so many different cards you can argue for this deck, but this is the ones that I have pretty much made sure that I can have always to prevent every single scenario from happening. For the Xyz monsters, 1 copy of Time Star. You can arguably play a second one. This card is actually really good. Being able to just search Joker and normal summon to get you any card is really broken, but the second effect is what's most important, because you can just protect your scales and use your Time Pendulum Graphs, both effects, so you can get rid of 2 cards. So this is why this card is really good. You can also bring it back with your Time Star, with your Black Fang Magician, so you can have another monster on the field, so that's really good as well. We play 1 copy of Supreme King Dark Rebellion. This card is the 1 kill button. This card just wins so many games, especially with Double Iris, being able to go into so many different stuff, because you can just make a spellcaster deal double damage over a monster you have halved your opponent with your Black Fang, and then use this on another monster to basically deal like 5000 damage or even more to your opponent. It's so easy to one-turn kill your opponent. It's basically the own deck's Utopia double, and you don't really need to play Utopia double, even though you could because it's a rank 4 spam deck, but I still don't think you need it. This card just replaces it without even having to play the brick and the 2 monsters in the extra deck. So this is why, on top of being able to use double Iris on another monster, means that you can OTK your opponent very, very easily, even without access code, even without Boral Sword. 1 copy of Tornado Dragon. I would still play this even if I was not playing Dagda, because it's such a good card against certain decks. I mean, you're going to see a lot more control decks this format, so being able to pop back row on top of having your Time Pendulum graph is super important. But still, even if you did not think that this was going to be relevant, with Scythe in the main deck, if you decide to play that engine, you have to play this card so you can basically stop your opponent from playing. And 1 copy of Dweller. Dweller is going to be really good this format, with decks like Drytron, decks like Salamangreat being pretty good this format. You really need Dweller in your extra deck, and you can play Baguska if you want, but I don't think Baguska really does a lot, because when you rely on the artifact engine, basically Baguska does what Scythe does, but less, and Scythe is just a better card, but you cannot play both Scythe and Baguska on the same field, because Baguska is just going to negate the Scythe, so I think Dweller is a much better card. For the Link monsters, we have 1 copy of Linkuriboh. There have been scenarios where I would just normal summon a Tuning Magician, get to the grave, get it back from the grave, and then go into Dagda, so basically you can get into the Link play like that, because sometimes the normal summon will be actually Tuning Magician, then this is why this Linkuriboh can come up a lot. We have 1 copy of Dagda. Like I said, this card is the main win button going first, because you try to lock out your opponent and then OTK them during the next turn. 1 copy of Masquerena. This is the monster you go to if you know that your opponent plays a deck that doesn't lose the Scythe, so you can just go into Unicorn and do more plays. 1 copy of Needle Fiber. I explained like so many times why this card is so good with Tuning Magician. Being able to go into Appaloosa during your own turn and access code during your opponent's turn before you even Pendulum summon is so important. 1 copy of Unicorn, mainly because of Masquerena, but sometimes you know that your Selene is not going to resolve, but if your opponent lets your Needle Fiber resolve, or if you have another monster, if your Needle Fiber doesn't resolve, a Link 3 that can get rid of a card is super important, so that's why I think this card is much better than Phoenix in this deck. 1 copy of Selene, of course, you have to go into your access code in your Appaloosa. Speaking of which, we have 1 copy of access code, 1 copy of Appaloosa. If you do not have access code and you don't want to pay for it right now, you can replace it with Boral Sword, or you can replace it with another level 8 Synchro or another rank 4. You don't really need Boral Sword, to be honest. It's not like you summon access code to be able to do damage. That's not what the deck lacks. You summon this in order to bait cards or pop cards before you Pendulum summon. You don't care that much about being 5300 attack, you only care about popping monsters, but still, if you think that Boral Sword is necessary in order to go for game, then of course you can put in the extra deck. So yep, that's the deck, guys. Pendulums, I think, have been very nostalgic, to be honest. People hated them back in the day, but now that they've been out of the picture for so long, people are starting to be very nostalgic about these old days, and especially now that we haven't seen a good red Pendulum deck in such a long time. And I know that Pendulum players are probably the most dedicated fan base of anything in Yu-Gi-Oh! So I know that people are going to experiment, people are going to do everything in their power in order to make this playable again, and the more cards we get back from the ban list, the better things are going to be. So yep, that's the deck, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming videos, and we'll see you next time.